Welcome to Tech with Kaushik. This is part 2 of our complete practice question series for the AZ-104 Microsoft Azure Administrator exam. Test your knowledge with exam-focused questions covering key Azure administration concepts. Choose your answer before the timer ends, then review the correct answer, clear explanation, and practical exam tip. Let us begin part 2. Question number 49. Requires careful analysis. We are now working with managed disks. Analyze the scenario before evaluating the choices. You deploy a highly secure Windows virtual machine named SECVM. Security compliance dictates that both the OS and data disks must be encrypted. Furthermore, the encryption must be maintained strictly inside the VHD if an administrator downloads the disk image to an on-premises data center. The encryption keys must be managed in an Azure Key Vault. Which encryption solution fulfills the strict portability requirement? Eliminate any option that fails a requirement. Consider option A, Azure Disk Encryption, ADE. Consider option B, server-side encryption with customer-managed keys, SSE with CMK. Consider option C, encryption at host. Consider option D, Azure Storage Service Encryption, SSE with PMK. In this case, select option A, Azure Disk Encryption, ADE. The reasoning is as follows. Azure Disk Encryption, ADE, uses BitLocker, Windows, or dmcrypt, Linux, inside the guest OS. This means the encryption happens inside the VHD. If the VHD is downloaded from Azure, it remains fully encrypted and requires the BitLocker recovery key/password to access locally. Now consider why the remaining options are unsuitable. B and D, server-side encryption, SSE, encrypts data at rest on the underlying Azure Storage Fabric. If you download the VHD, the Azure Fabric decrypts it seamlessly during the read operation, resulting in an unencrypted file downloaded locally. C, encryption at host encrypts data as it travels from the compute host to the storage host, but does not embed BitLocker into the VHD itself. The key takeaway is if requirements state that a downloaded VHD must remain encrypted, you must use Azure Disk Encryption, ADE. SSE only protects the data while it physically resides on Azure storage media. Apply precise reasoning to question number 50. Pay close attention to every stated constraint. A global enterprise has 12 virtual networks across Central US, West Europe, and Japan East. The VNets are connected by supported global VNet peering in a full mesh topology, and 20 virtual machines are distributed across them. You can deploy Azure Bastion standard in any one VNet. You need browser-based RDP and SSH access to every VM without assigning public IP addresses to the virtual machines. What is the minimum number of Azure Bastion hosts required? Compare every choice before deciding. Next, option A 1. Next, option B 3. Next, option C 12. Next, option D 20. The appropriate choice is option A1. Azure Bastion can connect to virtual machines in locally or globally peered VNets. One standard Bastion host in a central VNet can therefore serve all reachable peered VNets. The incorrect choices fail for the following reasons. B. One host per region is not required when global peering is supported. C. Bastion does not have to be deployed in every peered VNet. D. Bastion is shared by reachable virtual machines and is not deployed per VM. A centralized Bastion deployment can serve virtual machines in both regional and globally peered VNets, verify SKU features, routing, and permissions. Review question number 51. Carefully. Consider the following scenario. You manage an Azure subscription named Subprod. Within this subscription, there is a resource group named RGNet containing a virtual network named VNet Core. An administrator named Admin Dev is currently assigned the reader, security admin, and security reader built-in roles at the Subprod subscription scope. You need to grant Admin Dev the ability to assign the reader role for VNet Core to other members of the development team. The solution must follow the principle of least privilege. What should you do? Review each available choice. Choice A, assign admin dev the role-based access control administrator role for VNet Core. Choice B, assign admin dev the network contributor role for RGNet. Choice C, remove admin dev's current roles at the subscription scope and assign the contributor role for subprod. Choice D, assign admin dev the owner role for VNet Core. The best answer is option A, assign admin dev the role-based access control administrator role for VNet Core. The requirement is satisfied because role-based access control administrator includes Microsoft authorization/role assignments/right and can delegate Azure RBAC access without granting resource management permissions. Assigning it at VNet Core is the narrowest scope that meets the requirement. The remaining options are incorrect because B, network contributor can manage network resources but cannot create role assignments. C, contributor at subscription scope is broader and still cannot grant access. D, owner can assign roles, but it also grants full resource management and is not least privilege. Exam tip. For access delegation without resource ownership, prefer role-based access control administrator at the smallest required scope. Question number 52. Highlights an important distinction. We are moving to storage accounts. The central scenario is as follows. You have an Azure subscription named Subdata. Your organization needs to transfer 8 terabytes of on-premises archival data into Subdata. You have decided to use an Azure import-export job for this transfer. Which of the following resources can be used as the destination for the imported data? Focus on the distinction between these options. Option A, Azure Blob Storage. Option B, Azure SQL Database. Option C, Azure Data Factory. Option D, Azure File Sync Storage Sync Service. The required response is option A, Azure Blob Storage. The key reason is the Azure import-export service is used to securely transfer large amounts of data to Azure Blob Storage and Azure Files by shipping disk drives to an Azure data center. Therefore, Azure Blob Storage is a supported destination. The other choices do not satisfy the requirement because B, Azure SQL Database is a relational database service and is not a direct destination for an import-export job. C, Azure Data Factory is an integration service, not a storage destination for the import-export physical drive shipping process. D, Azure File Sync is used to synchronize on-premises file servers with Azure Files. It is not a destination for the import-export service. A useful examination rule is this. While Azure Data Box is the modern recommended approach for large physical data transfers, Azure Import-Export still supports shipping your own drives to Azure Blob Storage and Azure Files. Question number 53. Your Azure subscription contains 3 virtual networks configured as follows. VNet A, East US address space 10.5.128.0/23. Contains subnet A, 10.5.128.0/24. VNet B, East US address space 192.168.0.0/16. Contains subnet B1, 192.168.0.0/17, and subnet B2, 192.168.128.0/17. VNet C, East US address space 172.16.0.0/16. Contains subnet C, 172.16.1.0/24. You plan to deploy an Azure Container Apps Workload Profiles environment named ENV App1 in the East US region. The environment must use an existing virtual network and a newly created dedicated subnet delegated to Microsoft Apps/environments. Use the smallest supported subnet size. Select the appropriate virtual network and subnet mask. Choose the correct entry for every drop-down field. Review Statement 1. To which virtual network can you connect ENV App1? The blank. Select from VNet A only, VNet B only, VNet C only, VNet A or VNet B only, VNet A or VNet C only, or VNet A, VNet B, or VNet C. Review Statement 2. Which subnet mask should you use? The blank. Select from /16, /23, /24, /26, /27, or /28. For Statement 1, select VNet A or VNet C only. Both networks have unallocated address space large enough for a new /27 subnet. For Statement 2, select /27. /27 is the smallest supported infrastructure subnet for a workload profiles environment. Remember this distinction for the exam. Container apps workload profiles environments support smaller infrastructure subnets than legacy consumption-only environments. Verify the environment type before sizing. Let us examine question number 55. Review the scenario carefully. You are preparing to deploy 4 new Azure web apps. The web apps will use the following runtime stacks: App 1, ASP.NET Framework 4.8 App 2, .NET 8, LTS, App 3, PHP 8.3 App 4, Python 3.11. What is the minimum number of app service plans you must create to host all 4 web apps? Compare the following options. Option A is 1. Option B is 2. Option C is 3. Option D is 4. The correct answer is option B 2. This is correct because ASP.NET Framework requires a Windows App Service plan. PHP and Python are hosted on Linux App Service, while .NET 8 can run on either operating system. One Windows plan and one Linux plan are therefore sufficient. The alternatives can be eliminated because A single plan cannot mix Windows and Linux apps. C and D, separate plans for every runtime are unnecessary because apps can share a plan when the operating system, region, and pricing requirements are compatible. Keep this examination point in mind. An app service plan has one operating system. Runtime diversity alone does not require separate plans, but Windows and Linux workloads do. Let us work through question number 56. Let us first review the situation. You have an Azure storage account named Data1 that contains Azure Blob containers and Azure file shares. You are automating file and directory data transfers from an on-premises server to Data1 by using AZ-copy. The identities used for Microsoft Entra authentication have the required data plane roles. Select the supported authentication methods for AZ-copy when transferring data to each storage type. Select the value that correctly completes each statement. For the first statement, authentication for Azure Blob Storage, the blank. The options for this statement are Microsoft Entra ID only, Shared Access Signatures, SAS, only, or Microsoft Entra ID and Shared Access Signatures, SAS. For the second statement, authentication for Azure File Storage, the blank. The options for this statement are Microsoft Entra ID only, Shared Access Signatures, SAS, only, or Microsoft Entra ID and Shared Access Signatures, SAS. Statement 1 should be completed with Microsoft Entra ID and Shared Access Signatures, SAS. Both OAuth and SAS are supported for blob data operations. Statement 2 should be completed with Microsoft Entra ID and Shared Access Signatures, SAS. Both identity-based authorization and SAS are supported for file and directory transfers. The key takeaway is AZ-copy authentication support can differ by command and resource level. Distinguish file data operations from share or account management operations. We will now analyze question number 57. Begin by examining the scenario. You have an Azure subscription and an Azure Resource Manager, ARM, template named deploy_rg.json. None of the resource groups named RG-App0 through RG-App3 exists before the deployment. The template contains the following resource definition block: type, Microsoft Resources/Resource Groups, API version, April 1, 2021, location, North Europe, name, concat, RGApp- copy index, copy, name, RG loop, count, 4. You deploy the template by using new AZ subscription deployment location West Europe template file deploy rg.json. For each statement, select yes if the statement is true. Otherwise, select no. Review Statement 1. The template will create a resource group named RG-App0 in the North Europe region. Review Statement 2. The deployment command will create exactly 4 new resource groups. Review Statement 3. The template will create a resource group named RG-App3 in the West Europe region. The answer to statement 1 is yes. The first loop index is 0 and the resource location is North Europe. The answer to statement 2 is yes. Count is 4 and the scenario confirms none of the 4 target groups already exists. The answer to statement 3 is no. RGApp3 is created in North Europe, West Europe is the deployment record location. At subscription scope, the deployment location is for deployment metadata, each resource still uses the location defined in the template. Proceed to question number 58. This question moves us into template modification. Consider this scenario. You are authoring an Azure Resource Manager, ARM, template to deploy a virtual machine named VMweb. The virtual machine requires a custom script extension to configure IIS after deployment. In which order must these resources be deployed to satisfy their dependencies? The sequence must use these items. Item 1. Custom script extension. Item 2. Network interface. Item 3. Virtual network. Item 4. Virtual machine. The correct sequence is as follows. The first item is virtual network. The second item is network interface. The third item is virtual machine. The fourth item is custom script extension. Here is the technical justification. The network interface references a subnet in the virtual network. The virtual machine references the network interface. The extension is a child resource of the deployed virtual machine and can run only after the VM exists. Exam tip. ARM can deploy independent resources in parallel, use dependencies only where one resource consumes another resource's output or identity. The next item is question number 59. Scenario. You have an Azure subscription containing 3 virtual networks, VNet A, VNet B, and VNet C. The virtual network peerings are configured as follows. VNet A is peered with VNet B, VNet B is peered with VNet A, and VNet C is peered with VNet B. Each virtual network contains one virtual machine with a private IP address. VMA is in VNet A, VMB is in VNet B, VMC is in VNet C. You deploy an Azure Bastion host to a dedicated subnet in VNet A. Through the Azure Bastion host in VNet A, which virtual machines can you access using the Azure portal? The options are: Option A, VMA only. Option B, VMA and VMB only. Option C, VMA and VMC only. Option D, VMA, VMB, and VMC. The appropriate choice is option B, VMA and VMB only. The reasoning is as follows. Azure Bastion provides secure RDP-SSH connectivity to virtual machines located in the same virtual network as the Bastion host, as well as to virtual machines in directly peered virtual networks. Because VNet A is directly peered with VNet B, Bastion can reach VMB. However, VNet peering is not transitive. VNet A is not directly peered with VNet C, so traffic cannot traverse VNet B to reach VNet C. Therefore, Bastion and VNet A cannot access VMC. A. Bastion can access virtual machines in directly peered virtual networks, so VMB is also accessible. C. VMC is not accessible because there is no direct peering between VNet A and VNet C. D. VMC is unreachable because VNet peering is non-transitive. A useful examination rule is this. VNet peering is strictly non-transitive. If VNet 1 is peered with VNet 2, and VNet 2 is peered with VNet 3, resources in VNet 1 cannot communicate with VNet 3 unless you create an explicit direct peering between VNet 1 and VNet 3. Let us work through question number 61. Begin by examining the scenario. You manage an Azure subscription named subprod. Within this subscription, there is a resource group named RGNet containing a virtual network named VNet Core. An administrator named admin dev is currently assigned the reader, security admin, and security reader built-in roles at the subprod subscription scope. You need to grant admin dev the ability to assign the reader role for VNet Core to other members of the development team. The solution must follow the principle of least privilege. What should you do? Now examine the possible answers. Choice A, assign admin dev the user access administrator role for VNet Core. Choice B, assign admin dev the network contributor role for VNet Core. Choice C, remove admin dev's current roles at the subscription scope and assign the contributor role for subprod. Choice D, assign admin dev the contributor role for VNet Core. In this case, select option A, assign admin dev the user access administrator role for VNet Core. To delegate the ability to assign Azure RBAC roles to other users on a specific resource, the assigned role must include the Microsoft authorization/role assignment/right permission. The user access administrator role allows a user to manage access to Azure resources. Assigning this role specifically on the VNet limits their access management privileges to just that virtual network, adhering to the principle of least privilege. Now consider why the remaining options are unsuitable. B. Network contributor allows creating and managing networking resources but does not include permission to assign RBAC roles to other users. C. The contributor role specifically denies the ability to manage role assignments. D. The contributor role on the VNet does not permit the user to assign roles. Remember this distinction for the exam. Only the owner and user access administrator built-in roles grant the ability to assign roles to other users. User Access Administrator is preferable when you want to grant access management without granting full resource modification rights. Now consider question number 62. Review the situation. You manage an Azure subscription named Subprod. Within this subscription, there is a resource group named RGNet containing a virtual network named VNet Core. An administrator named Admin Dev is currently assigned the reader, security admin, and security reader built-in roles at the subprod subscription scope. You need to grant admin dev the ability to assign the reader role for VNet Core to other members of the development team. The solution must follow the principle of least privilege. What should you do? Choice A, remove admin dev's current roles at the subscription scope and assign the contributor role for subprod. Choice B, assign admin dev the user access administrator role for VNet Core. Choice C, assign admin dev the network contributor role for VNet Core. Choice D, remove admin dev from the security reader role for subprod and assign the contributor role for RGNet. The best answer is option B, assign admin dev the user access administrator role for VNet Core. The requirement is satisfied because to empower a user to manage RBAC role assignments for a resource without granting them full control over the resource's configuration, the user access administrator role is the correct built-in role. Applying it directly at the VNet Core scope enforces least privilege by ensuring they cannot modify roles elsewhere in the resource group or subscription. The incorrect choices fail for the following reasons. A. The contributor role at the subscription level explicitly denies the ability to assign roles. C. Network contributor provides full control over network configuration but lacks the Microsoft authorization/role assignment/right permissions. D. Removing security reader and adding contributor on the RG provides broader resource management access but still fails to provide role assignment permissions. Keep this examination point in mind. For RBAC delegation, remember that contributor can do almost anything except assign roles. Owner can do everything including assigning roles. User Access Administrator is specifically designed only to assign roles. The next item is question number 63. Next, we enter the topic of user and group properties. Consider this scenario. You manage a Microsoft Entra ID tenant. Your organization wants to assign licenses automatically through group membership. You need a Microsoft 365 group that contains only users in the information technology department who are located in Canada. How should you complete the dynamic membership rule? The first statement reads, Department condition, the blank EQ information technology. The available choices are user.department, device.management type, device.organizational unit, or user.usage location. The second statement reads, logical operator between conditions, the blank. The available choices are and, or type off. The third statement reads, country condition, user.country the blank Canada. The available choices are EQ, and, in, or match. The correct value for statement 1 is user.department. User.department stores the department value for a user object. The correct value for statement 2 is and. Both the department and country conditions must be true. The correct value for statement 3 is EQ. EQ performs an exact equality comparison. The key takeaway is dynamic user rules combine user properties with comparison operators, and requires every joined condition to evaluate as true. Proceed to question number 64. Scenario. You have an Azure subscription containing a resource group named RG Containers. You are automating the deployment of an Azure container instance named ACI Web. You want to ensure that the DNS name label scope reuse is securely configured so that only resources within your tenant can reuse the specific DNS name label. To configure the DNS name label scope reuse property for the container instance, what networking configuration is required? Review the options. Option A. The public networking type. Option B. A confidential SKU. Option C. The private networking type. Option D. A delegated subnet on a virtual network. The correct answer is option A. The public networking type. The key reason is in Azure Container Instances, ACI, a DNS name label can only be specified if the container group is deployed with a public IP address, the public networking type. The DNS name label scope reuse feature protects this public DNS name, for example, custom label angryfaceregion.azurecontainer.io, from being hijacked by restricting who can reuse it upon deletion. This configuration is not applicable to private networking, which relies on private DNS zones. The remaining options are incorrect because B, a confidential SKU encrypts data in use, memory, and does not govern DNS name label assignment or reuse scopes. C, a container instance deployed with a private networking type, in a virtual network, does not get a Microsoft-provided public DNS name label. D, while deploying into a VNet requires a delegated subnet, doing so makes the container private, thereby removing the ability to configure public DNS name label scope reuse. DNS name label scope reuse in ACI, tenant reuse, subscription reuse, resource group reuse, no reuse, prevents dangling DNS takeover attacks, but it is entirely tied to public IP configurations. We will now analyze question number 65. The focus now shifts to Azure RBAC. Consider the following scenario. You are creating a custom Azure role definition to delegate specific administrative tasks. The custom role must meet the following requirements: allow users to view the configuration properties of a virtual machine. Allow users to perform all possible actions on Azure App Service Plans, server farms. Strictly adhere to the principle of least privilege. Which permission strings should you include in the actions array of the custom role definition for each requirement? Review each blank and choose the most appropriate option. Statement 1. Perform all actions on App Service Plans, the blank. Choose between Microsoft Web/Server/Farms/*, Microsoft Web/Server/Farms/delete, or Microsoft Web/Server/Farms/write. Statement 2. View the configuration properties of a virtual machine, the blank. Choose between Microsoft Compute/Virtual Machines/*, Microsoft Compute/Virtual Machines/read, or Microsoft Compute/Virtual Machines/Instance View/read. The answer to the first statement is Microsoft Web/Server/Farms/*. The wildcard * grants full permissions, read, write, delete, action, over App Service Plans, server farms. The answer to the second statement is Microsoft Compute/Virtual Machines/read. The read action specifically grants permission to view the resources configuration, satisfying the least privilege requirement. Exam tip. In Azure RBAC role definitions, read typically allows viewing the resource configuration properties via GET requests, write allows creating or updating via put/patch, and delete allows removal via delete. The * wildcard grants all capabilities under that namespace. Question number 67. Your Azure subscription contains 3 virtual networks, VNet WE, West Europe contains subnet WE. No service endpoints configured. VNet SC, South Central US contains subnet SC Microsoft Storage Service Endpoint enabled. VNet SE, Southeast Asia contains subnet SE Microsoft Storage Service Endpoint enabled. You have 3 storage accounts, STGWE, West Europe, STGSC, South Central US, STGSE, Southeast Asia. You create a service endpoint policy named Policy SC in South Central US. The policy is configured to allow all storage accounts in the current subscription. For each statement, select yes if the statement is true. Otherwise, select no. Statement 1. Policy SC can be associated with subnet SE. Statement 2. If Policy SC is not associated with any subnet, it does not restrict Microsoft Storage Service Endpoint traffic from subnet SC to STGWE, STGSC, or STGSE. Statement 3. If Policy SC is associated with subnet SC, it automatically blocks traffic to STGSE because STGSE is outside the policy's region. Statement 1. The answer is no. Policy SC and VNet SE are in different regions. Statement 2. The answer is yes. A policy filters traffic only after it is associated with a subnet. Statement 3. The answer is no. The policy's allowed resources can be global. STGSE is included by the subscription-wide configuration. A useful examination rule is this. Service endpoint policies filter destinations, they do not replace storage firewalls, and their policy resource must match the virtual network's region. Review question number 68. Carefully. Let us first review the situation. You manage an Azure Stream Analytics job named SA Job 1 that ingests data from an IoT hub. You want to configure Azure Monitor alerts to notify the operations team if the job falls behind on processing incoming telemetry. Which metric should you monitor to identify the number of input events that are currently queued and waiting to be processed by SA Job 1? Choose from the following options. Option A is late input events. Option B is backlogged input events. Option C is out-of-order events. Option D is output events. The required response is option B, backlogged input events. This is correct because in Azure Stream Analytics, the backlogged input events metric tracks the number of input events that have been received by the job but are currently queued in the backlog and waiting to be processed. Monitoring this metric helps identify if the job is falling behind or requires scaling to keep up with the ingress rate. The other choices do not satisfy the requirement because A. Late input events tracks events that arrived later than the configured late arrival tolerance window and were subsequently dropped or adjusted by the job. C. Out-of-order events tracks events that arrived out of chronological sequence based on the out-of-order tolerance window. D. Output events tracks the number of events that were successfully processed and written to the output sink. Remember this distinction for the exam. A consistently high or growing backlogged input events metric usually indicates that the Stream Analytics job lacks sufficient streaming units, SUs, to process the incoming data stream in real time. Now consider question number 69. Review the situation. You manage an Azure subscription with 2 virtual machines, VMwin, Windows Server VM configured with Azure Disk Encryption, ADE. VMLin, Linux VM configured with Trusted Launch. You have provisioned the following backup vaults and policies: RSV1, a recovery services vault containing policy standard, type, standard, and policy enhanced, type, enhanced. BV1, a backup vault containing policy vault, type, backup policy. You configure protection by using the Azure portal. For each statement, select yes if the statement is true. Otherwise, select no. The first statement is, VMwin can be backed up using policy standard in RSV1. The second statement is, VMLin can be backed up using policy vault in BV1. The third statement is, VMLin can be backed up using policy enhanced in RSV1. For the first statement, choose yes. Standard Azure VM Backup supports virtual machines protected by Azure Disk Encryption. For the second statement, choose No. Azure VM Backup is configured in a Recovery Services vault, not an Azure Backup vault. For the third statement, choose Yes. Enhanced Policy supports Trusted Launch VM Backup through the Azure portal. Keep this examination point in mind. Recovery Services vaults protect complete Azure virtual machines. Backup vaults protect supported newer workloads such as disks and blobs rather than full virtual machines. The next item is question number 70. We are moving to Azure Monitor Logs. Scenario. You manage an Azure subscription containing virtual machines that run Windows Server. You are configuring a data collection rule, DCR, to ingest logs via the Azure Monitor Agent, AMA. You only want to collect Windows application event logs that have an event ID of 2000. Which query syntax must you use to filter the event logs within the DCR data source configuration? Available choices. Choice A, XPath. Choice B, KQL, Custo Query Language. Choice C, SQL. In this case, select option A, XPath. Here is the technical justification. When configuring a data collection rule, DCR, for the Azure Monitor Agent, AMA, you must use XPath queries to filter which specific Windows event logs are collected at the source. This ensures only relevant events, like a specific event ID, are ingested, reducing log analytics costs and noise. The alternatives can be eliminated because B, KQL is used to query the logs after they have been ingested into a log analytics workspace, not for filtering at the source within a DCR. C, SQL is not supported for defining data sources in a data collection rule. The key takeaway is the Azure Monitor Agent relies heavily on data collection rules, DCRs, to dictate what telemetry is collected. For Windows event logs, the filtering syntax within the DCR is always XPath. Let us examine question number 71. Review the scenario carefully. Your organization has an Azure virtual machine named VM Cloud in a virtual network. The virtual network is connected to your on-premises data center through ExpressRoute. You need to use an on-premises physical server named ServerDB as a source endpoint in Azure Connection Monitor. ServerDB has not yet been onboarded to Azure Arc. Which agent must you install first on ServerDB so that Azure can register it as an Arc-enabled server and make it eligible for the remaining Connection Monitor extensions? Choose from the following options. Choice A, the Azure Monitor Agent extension. Choice B, the Azure Network Watcher Agent Virtual Machine extension. Choice C, the Log Analytics Agent. Choice D, the Azure Connected Machine Agent. The appropriate choice is option D, the Azure Connected Machine Agent. The reasoning is as follows. Connection Monitor supports on-premises source endpoints as Azure Arc-enabled servers. The Azure Connected Machine Agent is installed first to onboard the physical server to Azure Arc. Azure Monitor Agent and the Network Watcher extension can then be enabled for the connectivity tests. A, AMA is installed on the Arc-enabled resource after onboarding. B, the Network Watcher extension also requires the machine to be Arc-enabled first. C, the legacy Log Analytics Agent is no longer supported for new on-premises Connection Monitor sources. For a non-Azure Connection Monitor source, onboard the machine to Azure Arc first, then enable AMA and the Network Watcher extension. Question number 72. Next, we enter the topic of network insights. Consider this scenario. You manage an Azure subscription and plan to use traffic analytics to analyze user and application traffic. You deploy VM App 1 in a virtual network named vNetApp. The VM's network interface is associated with a network security group named NSGApp. Which setting must you configure to collect supported flow data for traffic analytics? The options are: Option A, Virtual Network Flow Logs for vNetApp. Option B, Diagnostic Settings for VM App 1. Option C, VM Insights for VM App 1. Option D, Diagnostic Settings for NSGApp. The best answer is option A, virtual network flow logs for vNetApp. Traffic Analytics analyzes flow log data. New NSG flow logs can no longer be created, so supported new deployments use virtual network flow logs for the virtual network and enable traffic analytics on that flow log configuration. Now consider why the remaining options are unsuitable. B. VM diagnostic settings do not collect network flow records. C. VM Insights monitors guest performance and dependencies, not network watcher flow logs. D. NSG diagnostic settings are not the traffic analytics data source. Exam tip. Use virtual network flow logs for new traffic analytics deployments, and SG flow logs are on a retirement path. Now consider question number 73. You have 5 Azure virtual machines running Windows Server. Each VM hosts web applications in IIS and has Azure Monitor Agent installed. A log analytics workspace already exists. You need to collect raw IIS access log files as custom text logs and send them to the workspace by using a data collection rule, DCR. Public Azure Monitor endpoints are permitted, private link is not required. Before you create the DCR, what must you create in the log analytics workspace to receive the records? Review the options. Choice A. An Azure Monitor Private Link Scope, AMPLS. Choice B. A private endpoint. Choice C. Diagnostic settings. Choice D. VM Insights. Choice E. A custom table. The required response is option E. A custom table. The requirement is satisfied because a custom text log DCR sends parsed records to a custom log analytics table. The destination table and its schema must exist before the DCR can map and ingest the IIS log fields. The incorrect choices fail for the following reasons. A and B, AMPLS and private endpoints are required only for private monitoring connectivity. C, diagnostic settings collect Azure platform logs, not guest IIS text files through AMA. D. VM Insights is not a prerequisite for custom text log ingestion. A useful examination rule is this. For AMA custom text logs, define the destination custom table and schema, then create the DCR and transformation that maps records into that table. Proceed to question number 75. The focus now shifts to template interpretation. Review the situation. You are reviewing an Azure Resource Manager, ARM, template designed to provision a standard infrastructure environment. The template includes definitions for the following resource types: Microsoft network/public IP addresses, PIP web, Microsoft network/network security groups, NSG web, Microsoft network/virtual networks, VNet web, Microsoft network/network interfaces, NIC web, Microsoft compute/virtual machines, VM web. To ensure the deployment succeeds without dependency errors, which resource must be explicitly referenced in the Depends On section of the VM web resource definition? Option A, PIP web. Option B, VNet web. Option C, NSG web. Option D, NIC web. The correct answer is option D, NIC web. The key reason is in an ARM template, the Depends On section instructs Azure Resource Manager to wait for one resource to finish deploying before starting another. An Azure virtual machine cannot be provisioned unless its primary network interface, NIC, already exists. Therefore, VM web must have an explicit dependency on NIC web. The remaining options are incorrect because A, the public IP must be created before the NIC, so the NIC depends on the PIP. But the VM does not explicitly need to depend on the PIP. The dependency flows through the NICB, the VNet must exist before the NIC can be created. The NIC depends on the VNet, not the VM directly. C. The NSG must exist before the NIC can be associated with it. Again, the NIC depends on the NSG. Remember this distinction for the exam. In ARM and BICEP, dependencies should form a chain, VNet/subnet/NSG/PIP leads to NIC leads to VM extensions. You only need to declare the immediate parent dependency. We will now analyze question number 76. Begin by examining the scenario. You are provisioning a new Azure storage account named Scannalytics. The storage account must meet the following configuration requirements: support big data analytics workloads natively using Azure Data Lake Storage Generation 2. Automatically replicate data to a secondary Azure region to protect against regional outages. Optimize costs for data that will be stored long-term and accessed infrequently. Which 3 options should you configure when creating Scannalytics? Select 3. Each correct answer presents part of the solution. More than one answer may be correct. Now examine the possible answers. Option A is the cool access tier. Option B is zone redundant storage, ZRS. Option C is geo-redundant storage, GRS. Option D is hierarchical namespace. Option E is the hot access tier. Select option A. The cool access tier, option C geo-redundant storage, GRS, and option D hierarchical namespace. This is correct because the solution must satisfy 3 distinct requirements. To support Azure Data Lake Storage natively for big data analytics, you must enable the hierarchical namespace feature during storage account creation. To automatically replicate data to a secondary region, you must select geo-redundant storage, GRS, or read access geo-redundant storage, RAGRS. To optimize costs for data accessed infrequently, you should set the default account access tier to cool. The other choices do not satisfy the requirement because B, zone redundant storage, ZRS, replicates data synchronously across 3 availability zones within a single region. It does not protect against a full regional outage. E, the hot access tier optimizes performance for frequently accessed data, which incurs higher storage costs and violates the requirement to minimize costs for infrequently accessed data. Keep this examination point in mind. The hierarchical namespace setting is the fundamental toggle that transforms a standard blob storage account into an Azure Data Lake Storage Generation 2 account, enabling directory-level semantics and POSIX access control. The next item is question number 77. This question moves us into shared access signatures. Scenario. You have an Azure storage account that hosts a blob container named Reports Container. An external auditing firm needs access to download all files within Reports Container for the next 48 hours. You must provide the firm with a connection string or token that grants read-only access, allows both HTTP and HTTPS, and expires automatically. Which method should you use? Available choices. Choice A. An access policy. Choice B, Azure Content Delivery Network, CDN. Choice C, access keys. Choice D. A shared access signature, SAS. The best answer is option D. A shared access signature, SAS. Here is the technical justification. A shared access signature, SAS, provides granular, time-limited delegated access to resources in a storage account. You can configure a SAS token to grant precise permissions, like read-only, restrict allowed protocols, HTTP and HTTPS, and set a strict expiration time, for example, 48 hours. A service SAS generated at the container level applies these permissions to all content within the container. The alternatives can be eliminated because A, an access policy, stored access policy, is used to manage and revoke SAS tokens, but you must still generate the SAS token itself to grant the actual HTTP/HTTPS connection string. B, Azure CDN is used to cache static web content globally for performance, not to restrict time-limited delegated authorization. C, access keys grant full administrative control, root access, over the entire storage account and cannot be restricted to read-only or set to expire. The key takeaway is always use a SAS instead of an access key when sharing data with external clients to adhere to the principle of least privilege. Now consider question number 78. You manage an Azure App Service web app named Web App Sales. You are troubleshooting performance issues and need to route the platform diagnostic logs to a central location where you can run complex Kusto query language, KQL, queries to analyze HTTP 500 errors over time. Which destination should you configure in the diagnostic settings of the app service? Review the options. Option A, send to a log analytics workspace. Option B, archive to a storage account. Option C, stream to an Azure Event Hub. In this case, select option A, send to a log analytics workspace. The reasoning is as follows. To run complex log analysis using the Custo query language, KQL, the diagnostic logs must be ingested into an Azure Log Analytics workspace. This destination structures the log data into queryable tables that Azure Monitor log queries natively support. B. Archiving to a storage account is highly cost-effective for long-term compliance retention, but the data is stored as JSON blobs which cannot be natively queried with KQL without external processing. C. Streaming to an event hub is used to route logs to third-party SIEM tools or custom applications in real time, not for native KQL querying within Azure Monitor. Whenever a scenario asks how to analyze or query diagnostic logs interactively using KQL, the required destination is always a log analytics workspace. Proceed to question number 79. Consider this scenario. You are an administrator for a Microsoft Entra ID tenant. Your company has acquired a smaller business, and you need to grant 300 external contractors access to your internal SharePoint sites. You have a CSV file containing their names and personal email addresses. You want to write a PowerShell script to automate the creation of these guest user accounts. Which Microsoft Graph PowerShell template should your script use to fulfill this requirement? Choice A. New MG user. Choice B. New MG invitation. Choice C. Add MG group member. Choice D. New AZ-AD user. The appropriate choice is option B. New MG invitation. To create a guest user account, B2B collaboration user, in Microsoft Entra ID via Microsoft Graph PowerShell, you must generate an invitation using the new MG invitation template. This sends an email to the external user with a redemption link and creates a guest stub object in the directory. Now consider why the remaining options are unsuitable. A. New MG user is used exclusively to create internal cloud-only member accounts. It cannot be used to invite external guest users. C. Add MG group member is used to add an existing user object to a group. It does not create or invite a new guest user. D. New AZ-AD user is part of the older Azure AD PowerShell module, which is deprecated, and, like new MG user, was used for internal users. The legacy template for guests was new Azure AD MS invitation. Exam tip. Internal Entra ID users are created. External B2B users are invited. Always map the guest requirement to the invitation templates or API endpoints. Review question number 80. Carefully. Review the scenario carefully. You have an Azure subscription with multiple virtual networks and virtual machines deployed across the East US region. You have been tasked with identifying top talkers, malicious traffic, and geographic traffic patterns by using traffic analytics in Azure Network Watcher. Which two Azure resources must you provision to support the collection and analysis of this traffic data? Select 2. Each correct answer presents part of the solution. Choose every option that satisfies the requirement. Review each available choice. Option A is a data collection rule, DCR, in Azure Monitor. Option B is a log analytics workspace. Option C is an Azure Monitor workbook. Option D is a storage account. Option E is a Microsoft Sentinel workspace. The required selections are option B, a log analytics workspace, and option D, a storage account. The requirement is satisfied because traffic analytics processes network flow logs. The flow log configuration uses a storage account for raw flow records, and traffic analytics sends processed analytics data to a log analytics workspace for querying and visualization. The incorrect choices fail for the following reasons. A DCR controls Azure Monitor agent collection and is not a traffic analytics prerequisite. C. A workbook can visualize results but is not required to collect or analyze them. E. Microsoft Sentinel can consume the workspace data but is not required for traffic analytics. A useful examination rule is this. Traffic analytics needs storage for raw virtual network flow logs and a log analytics workspace for processed insights. Let us work through question number 81. Consider the following scenario. You are configuring Azure Monitor to track the performance of a critical database virtual machine. You plan to deploy an alert rule that triggers whenever the VM's available memory drops below 1 GB. When the alert fires, it must automatically send an email notification to the IT support team and a push notification to the on-call engineer's mobile app. What must you create in Azure Monitor to define these notification targets? Compare the following options. Choice A, a distribution group. Choice B, a Microsoft 365 group. Choice C, an action group. Choice D, a mail-enabled security group. The required response is option C. An action group. The key reason is in Azure Monitor, an alert rule dictates when to trigger the condition, while an action group dictates what happens when the alert triggers. An action group contains a list of notification preferences, like email, SMS, push, voice, and automated actions, like triggering a logic app, webhook, or runbook, that are executed upon firing. The remaining options are incorrect because A distribution group is an email entity in Exchange/Microsoft 365. While you can send an alert email to a distribution group, you cannot configure push notifications to the Azure mobile app through it. B. A Microsoft 365 group is a collaboration identity. It cannot directly handle Azure Monitor alert routing and push notifications. D. A mail-enabled security group manages access and can receive emails, but you still must configure an action group in Azure Monitor to target it and to include the push notification target. Remember this distinction for the exam. Alert rules equals the if. Action groups equals the then. Always use action groups to configure who gets notified and how they are notified when an Azure alert fires. Question number 83. Next, we enter the topic of Storage Explorer. Review the situation. Your organization provides laptops and mobile devices to developers. The device fleet consists of the following platforms: Laptop Win, Windows 11 Laptop Mac, Mac OS Laptop Lin, Ubuntu Linux Tablet iOS, iOS. On which of these devices can the developers install the Microsoft Azure Storage Explorer client natively? The options are: Option A, Laptop Win, Laptop Lin, and Laptop Mac only. Option B, Laptop Win only. Option C, Laptop Win, Laptop Mac, and Tablet iOS only. Option D, Laptop Win and Laptop Lin only. Option E, all devices. The correct answer is option A, Laptop Win, Laptop Lin, and Laptop Mac only. This is correct because Microsoft Azure Storage Explorer is a standalone GUI desktop application used to manage Azure storage data. It is officially supported and available for installation on Windows, Mac OS, and Linux operating systems. The other choices do not satisfy the requirement because B, it is not limited to Windows. C, it is not supported on iOS, mobile platforms. D, it is supported on Mac OS, not just Windows and Linux. E, it cannot be installed on iOS or Android devices natively. Keep this examination point in mind. Storage Explorer is a heavy desktop client, not a mobile app. It runs on Windows, Linux, and Mac OS. Mobile management is typically done via the Azure Portal web interface or the Azure mobile app, not Storage Explorer. Now consider question number 84. Consider this scenario. You manage an Azure subscription that contains the following storage accounts: STG Archive, Storage v2, Standard Performance, Locally Redundant Storage, LRS, Cool Access Tier STG App, Storage v2, Standard Performance, Read Access Geo-Redundant Storage, RAGRS, Hot Access Tier STG Files, Storage, General Purpose v1, Standard Performance, Locally Redundant Storage, LRS, STG blobs, block blob storage, premium performance, locally redundant storage, LRS. Your organization requires an existing locally redundant account to tolerate a data center failure within its region. Which account can request an in-place conversion directly to Zone Redundant Storage, ZRS, in the Azure portal? Available choices. Choice A, STG Archive. Choice B, STG App. Choice C, STG Files. Choice D, STG Blobs. The appropriate choice is option A, STG Archive. Here is the technical justification. STG Archive is a standard storage v2 account using LRS, an account type eligible to request an in-place LRS to ZRS conversion when the account's region supports ZRS. The alternatives can be eliminated because B, STG App is RAGRS, not a locally redundant account, its zone resilient geo option is RAGZRS. C, STG Files is a legacy GPv1 account and must first be upgraded to storage v2. D, premium block blob storage accounts do not use the same portal requested redundancy conversion path, migrate data to a new ZRS account when needed. The key takeaway is for standard GPv2 accounts, redundancy conversion can preserve the account endpoint, unsupported account kinds require an upgrade or data migration. Question number 85. Scenario. You manage an Azure subscription named Subfinance that contains a resource group named RGApp. Your organization previously used the classic co-administrator role, which has been retired. A finance IT manager now needs full control of resources and the ability to grant Azure RBAC access throughout Subfinance. Which current role assignment provides the closest supported replacement at the required scope? Review the options. Option A, assign the owner role at the Subfinance subscription scope. Option B, assign the contributor role at the Subfinance subscription scope. Option C, assign the owner role at the RGApp resource group scope. Option D, assign the global administrator role in Microsoft Entra ID. The best answer is option A, assign the owner role at the Subfinance subscription scope. The reasoning is as follows. Owner at subscription scope can manage all resources in the subscription and create Azure RBAC role assignments. It is the current Azure RBAC replacement that most closely matches the required classic co-administrator capabilities across Subfinance. B. Contributor cannot grant Azure RBAC access. C. Resource group scope would not cover the entire subscription. D. Global Administrator is a Microsoft Entra role and does not automatically grant Azure Resource Management permissions. Classic subscription administrator roles are retired. Use Azure RBAC roles such as owner at the appropriate resource scope. The next item is question number 86. This question moves us into blob lifecycle management. You manage an Azure storage account with these lifecycle management rules based on the condition if base blobs were last modified more than days ago. Rule A, prefix docs / more than 4 days leads to move to cool storage. Rule B, prefix docs / more than 7 days leads to move to archive storage. Rule C, prefix temp / more than 5 days leads to delete the blob on November 1st. You upload report.pdf in the hot tier under docs / and cache.tmp in the hot tier under temp /. No further modifications occur. Assume policy evaluation has completed before each stated observation. For each statement, select yes if the statement is true. Otherwise, select no. Review Statement 1. On November 7th, report.pdf will be stored in the cool access tier. Review Statement 2. On November 10th, report.pdf will be moved from the archive tier back to the cool access tier. Review Statement 3. On November 7th, cache.tmp will be stored in the archive tier. Statement 1 should be marked yes. It is more than 4 days old but not yet more than 7 days old. Statement 2 should be marked no. Lifecycle rules cannot automatically rehydrate a blob from archive to an online tier. Statement 3 should be marked no. The temp/rule deletes cache.tmp after more than 5 days, no archive action applies. Exam tip. Lifecycle policies can tier blobs down to cooler storage or delete them, but rehydrating from archive requires an explicit rehydration operation. You have completed Part 2 of the AZ-104 Microsoft Azure Administrator Exam Practice Series. Keep building your Azure administration skills by opening the complete playlist and continuing with the remaining parts in sequence. If this session helped your preparation, like the video, subscribe to Tech with Kaushik, and enable notifications for more certification exam practice content. Share your score, doubts, or feedback in the comments. I would be happy to hear how your preparation is going. Thank you for learning with Tech with Kaushik. Keep practicing, and I will see you in the next part.